Hi, this time I'm not going to talk about a scary topic so that you can use in your tabletop role playing games. This is going to be a sort of pause between this month of October series of scary related videos. In this video, I want to talk about a topic or a question suggested by Darren Nor. Hi, Darren. He suggested some things about um, combat as a storytelling tool or way to tell a story within role playing games, not just a mechanical event that just happens so that you can keep moving on to other things, other encounters within the adventure. I wanted to talk about this before the ideas escaped my mind. That is, I gave some thought to it, and I needed to talk right away about this before I perhaps lost before I lose track of some of the finer points. First, I'm going to read the comment posted by Darren, and I'm also going to read another comment that I think adds a lot of value to this question from Arcanum Syndicate. Okay, first let's talk about Darren's post. He writes, I would love it if you could delve into the issues associated with combat encounters as storytelling opportunities. There is a relentless push to reduce the time combat takes up during a game session, as if these are a distraction from the main campaign. Further combat game crunch is often used as a means to qualify a game outright without allowing for what kind of story is possible from a well-designed RPG combat system. You have used Hackmaster that is tracking actions in time, in seconds. How has this crunchiness translated into battle story unfolding from within the players expressing their moves and ideas? I've looked at your reviews and I am seeing your keen insight into how rule design facilitates co-created narrative. Our group loves combat. For myself, combat is narrative and not a distraction from it. Thanks, Darren. I will try to address those points in a few moments. Now, to this post, Arcanum Syndicate responded with, I love this. To me, it is right on. You can use combat in many systems and add narrative to it. One thing I have found is letting the player explain their actions and the way they defend certain attacks. The game master does not need to describe everything in the combat. I introduced this concept to one of my groups who were used to me describing things, so they were kind of uncomfortable when I introduced it and had a problem implementing it. So it became a good idea for me to introduce it lightly. For instance, when they would roll a critical hit and kill an enemy, I would ask, okay, what does that look like when you finish this one off? It became even more exciting to them to describe their amazing attack. After a while, it just becomes natural to them to describe how they defend an attack or how they would they wound a figure or even how they take damage. Then, of course, the game master can always stack more description on it to move it in the desired direction. Okay. Oh, by the way, if you haven't played Demon Gate, talking about Arcanum Syndicate, I'm going to put my playlist of Demon Gate reviews in the description below. You will find a review of the core rulebook, expansions, adventures, etc. This is one of the best combat systems currently. Demon Gate has a strategic, tactical, and crunchy system that is quite realistic within the fiction. You really have to put some thought into how things should proceed or your character will end up dying. Okay, going back to Darren's post. First, I would like to talk in favor of actually making combat shorter or faster or streamlining it, because later on I am going to praise combat, crunchy combat, simulationist type of combat in the best way possible. Well, I think there are some instances, some cases, in which it is actually worth it to shorten combat or reduce it or streamline it. For example, Maybe you are playing at a convention or you want to play just a single adventure, a one shot sort of experience, and you want to have several combats during the game. If you use a more crunchy system, perhaps a single combat or two could take up the entire session. Oh, excuse me. So, if you're playing at a convention and you have little time or just one shot, like I told you, and you want an adventure with 5 or 6 battles, then it's worth it to shorten combat, to simplify it or streamline it. It's also possible that you want to play a shorter campaign or perhaps even a long campaign, but you have a limited amount of time when it comes to you being able to commit to the campaign. So, for example, maybe one or more of the players are quite busy with work. They will have a very important project in a few months and they want to play a campaign before then, but they want a campaign with lots of battles. So in that case, it would also be worth it to streamline or simplify combat or shorten it so that they have lots of battles before time is up. Another reason as to why you would want to shorten combat is that, or put it aside, or whatever you want to do to minimize it, concerns those role-playing games that have a specific theme in mind. Like, for example, Golden Sky Stories. If you haven't played Golden Sky Stories, it's basically an anime sort of role-playing game, but one of those light-hearted anime experiences. It reads, or rather, it plays a lot like a children's book, so to speak, or children's anime or manga. You could play it in other ways, of course. You could add elements of comedy, something more, a bit more dramatic, but in general, combat is not the focus of that game. It is all about using magical powers and abilities to help people with different, more mundane problems, emotional situations, or issues. You can also play it with some serious battles, of course. For example, I played a session once that is I designed a scenario where the bad guys were basically like Pokemon ghosts. So it was easy for the characters to fight against them and just banish them. They weren't really killing them. It was still in theme, but it was still a very simplified system of combat. Golden Sky Stories is basically just one roll, or at most two in some complex situations, but it's just one roll to solve the situations. And using those points, I forgot how they call them, but it's basically a resource. In fact, it's been like 7 years since I played that game. I don't even remember if you have to roll. I don't remember what. Anyway, the point is that you are still in theme within that role playing game. Mm. So yeah, there are some good reasons as to why you want to minimize combat or shorten it. Sometimes, perhaps you are playing a role playing game with a more complicated subsystem focused on diplomatic matters or intrigue or other sorts of social situations. In that case, the focus is completely on those non-combat situations or encounters or events. So it makes sense that combat is put to the side, or you shorten it so that it doesn't take the spotlight from other situations. So yes, there are some cases. For example, in my upcoming review that I still want to keep as a surprise, and I think it's very much in theme with October, the the combat resolution is also quite simple. Just you make a single roll with a dice pool, but it's sort of dice pool that escalates or has a sort of cascade or waterfall effect. So it's just one roll and you solve combat with just that one check. But because it fits so well with the storytelling type of experience that it's trying to represent or portray, I think it works perfect for that sort of experience. So moving on to Darren's first point, that there is a relentless push to reduce the time combat takes up during a game session, and as if combat is just a distraction from the rest of the campaign. I think there is yes, a negative reason as to why this happens. Well, it depends on on many factors. But for example, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, the combat is quite smooth, and they created that sort of combat so that many people could learn it right away. So they were Wizards of the Coast were thinking of how to sell a lot of copies of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. So they focused on that easy to understand combat. It's not as technical as other systems. Imagine if they actually implemented a hackmaster style or of mechanics with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. A lot of people would have never tried to learn it or play it. A lot of people actually play it because they understand the combat. It's quite simple and easy. And I think some people perhaps didn't even play Dungeons and Dragons before they started saying that finally Dungeons and Dragons was playable, as if the other editions were impossible to play. So there is exaggeration, but the hard fact is that most people don't have too much time or do not have a good attention span, or sometimes are not equipped intellectually to learn a complex system in a short time. And added to that, a lot of people, well, they want immediate gratification. They want things now. They are not going to take perhaps a day or a few days, depending on the complexity, to learn the system. They just want to play right away. So Wizards of the Coast focused on this, and that's how Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition had such a lucrative success. And so, Darren, I think that most of the reasons as to why sometimes those more mainstream, to put it in a way, or popular role-playing games have that like short combat or simplified combat, it's because a lot of people would not play those games otherwise. I'm sure you are aware of that. Because if we were to compare it to, for example, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, with all of the rules, for example, from the combat options, those three black books that came out with more spells and rules for exhaustion and different random events between combat rounds, etc. Well, a lot of people would probably think that it's too complicated, especially with those weapons that are more useful against different types of armor. All sorts of intricacies or finer details concerning initiative. So yes, I think that's the main reason. Another reason as to why combat is somewhat simplified and streamlined, I think it's because a lot of people, and this is just based on my experience and my thoughts, of course, you can analyze if what I say makes some sense or not. I think some people are too disconnected from the reality of combat. They are mostly, they have experienced it through movies, anime, manga, cartoons, comic books. So their combat ideas are quite cinematic. They are not as simulationist. You said it yourself, Darren, that there is no perfect system to represent combat. I also believe that. I don't think there ever will. I think that some systems have a really good approach to simulationist combat, but going back to this point, a lot of people simply do not have an idea of how combat works in real life, and they have a more cinematic and at times perhaps a more yes, a less realistic idea of combat. So if the system is quite intricate, complex, realistic, they feel a bit at a loss as to what to do with those situations, trying to role play or describe those moments. Perhaps they feel a bit nervous that other players that are actually more familiar with with a more scientific or logic oriented approach to combat, they will feel like their descriptions are not enough, or that they are too phony or too spectacular. If you're playing a role-playing game that is a bit more realistic, at least in the combat aspect, they could feel a bit nervous about that, so they prefer to use systems that are more abstract and combat is solved in just a few rolls or just one roll. That could be another reason. I'm sure there are many other reasons, but I wanted to speak about this just to give a better framework. Hmm. Now, it's very important and interesting that you say that. Um, yeah, well, we talk about how some people could dismiss systems because of their crunchy or complex combat system, and then you tell me that I have used Hackmaster, and you ask how I integrated the narrative with the things that happen during a Hackmaster combat. Mm, I think that the combat encounters that I've had with Hackmaster are some of the richest, if not the richest, experiences when it comes to combat in role playing games. For those that do not know, Hackmaster works on a second by second sort of sequence. So every second something is happening. You can move your character each second. You never feel like you have to wait for your turn. Everything happens in a simultaneous way. So every time my players were moving their characters during a particular second, or unsheathing their weapons, readying an attack, they actually get really into it, because how the rules integrate with the story, because a combat is quite decisive. It's going to put a halt to the entire campaign if everyone dies, and you will have to create new characters or resurrect some other characters perhaps, or start a new campaign or start that campaign. It could happen in several ways, but the thing is that combat determines if you can keep on going with the campaign or if it stops right there. So when it comes to Hackmaster, it's like all of their attention is completely focused on those second by second moments. And the descriptions are also quite rich by necessity. In Hackmaster, when you make an attack with your two-handed sword or your axe or your knife, depending on the size of the weapon and how easy it is to use, well, you need a number of seconds as cooldown to recharge, so to speak, after an attack. Now, if you do not put effort into this description, it can turn into a very ridiculous situation in which you just swing your sword and now you have to wait, depending on your expertise, your familiarity with the weapon, when you create your character or when you level up. Maybe you need 5, 6, 7, or 8 seconds or more in the case of heavier weapons, and depending on the characters, etc. And so if you do not take a look or an approach to Hackmaster combat in a more realistic way, it's going to feel like the character just made an attack and he has to wait 8 seconds for it to for the cooldown, and then you get to attack again. And no, the players, at least in when I run when I run Hackmaster combats, my players are never static. They're always describing what their characters are doing. So, for example, if one character takes, like I said, 8 or 7 seconds of cooldown between attacks, he is talking about how his character is taking position, switching a bit to the flank, trying to get an opening to attack the enemy. He's also describing sometimes the mental process of his or her character, that also he's quite worried because he missed that attack and that enemy is probably perhaps using a poison dagger and he's going to attack him, and he's probably going to die if he's not careful. So they have those their lives flash before their eyes sort of moments. Or if they feel a bit more confident in their encounter, then they describe how the character is like moving the weapon around, trying to make feints and trick the opponent into lowering his or her guard, and trying to they expose themselves so that the opponent tries to attack them, and then they will strike. Or sometimes they like to describe that they are actually not waiting for the cooldown to be over. They are describing how they are still like sometimes clashing their weapons, or dodging or parrying, while the moment for the next attack happens. And so it's never a passive experience. It is quite organic, quite lively, and it really adds to the richness of the entire campaign. It also colors the characters' personality, their state of mind, and their emotional states. So characters that are constantly rushing in and doing all sorts of risky attacks, suddenly you start to get a sense that that character has a sort of death wish, or perhaps they are too reckless. While in contrast, another character that is more methodical or tactic or strategic, they could think that it's a very intelligent character, or they could think that he's such a scaredy cat. It depends on how they play the combat. So yes, those are some ways in which you can um, play combat directly into the narrative. So yes, Darren, undoubtedly, Hackmaster, like many other simulationist type of combat systems, they start to create stories, many amazing stories in mythology and history. They are focused on combat because in most cases combat solves everything. The reason why there is some semblance of harmony in the world is because there is the threat of violence. If something is transgressed, for better or for worse, there's always the threat of violence, of battle, of combat. Mm. So yes, combat is a form or a medium for description to make the narrative flow. It all depends on the experience that you are looking for. In my case, I love crunchy simulationist combat, but like I said, I understand what sometimes it's better to streamline or shorten combat. It all depends on what you want. Maybe you want a campaign with just a few major battles. Some of the cruncher systems could take an entire session if you are running a very detailed combat. And despite, like I said, simple combat sometimes sells better, there are still many designers that are bringing out their more simulationist and complex and description rich combat systems, such as Demon Gate, Hackmaster, of course, Mystic Forces, Bexith. There are so many out there, so many systems. It all depends on what you are looking for, but definitely combat adds a lot to the campaign, especially because it's such an important event. If you win or lose, it could spell the end of the campaign, or it could add to your glory and to your the treasure that you obtain. So combat, definitely a very important, and in some cases the most important part of a role-playing game. Depending on the campaign, for example, a military campaign, there's going to be combat definitely, but depending on if you want to explore more about the background of the soldiers participating in the campaign, or if you want to focus completely on the glory of battle at the present or a particular time in the campaign, then you can have a complex system with just one or two battles that happen in a single session, or many battles across a single day, so that you have a campaign with many tense situations, or just a few epic battles. It's all up to you how you want to run things. So that's my take on it, Darren. And thank you to Brandon from Arcanum Syndicate as well for his response. Mm. There's probably a lot more that I could say, but trying to focus on these main points, I think it is sufficient for the time. Thank you for watching, and if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending Right Through RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you. Perhaps tomorrow or the day after, I will upload my next Halloween type of video. It's going to be a very creepy video in my opinion. It will give you some ideas to create some scary adventures, And as a player character, it could end up giving you some tips or perhaps even some inspiration to come out victorious from those challenges that your game master is probably going to send your way. Once again, thank you and see you later.